In 2018, a team of geneticists working in Rakhigarhi, India, faced an impossible problem. They had excavated 61 ancient skeletons from a 4,500-year-old burial site. But when they tried to extract DNA, 60 samples failed completely. The tropical heat had destroyed the genetic material over millennia. Only one skeleton yielded usable DNA, just one, and that single genome would rewrite everything we thought we knew about human history. The research team was led by Harvard geneticist David Reich, whose lab had already revolutionized our understanding of ancient migrations. When they sequenced this Harappan woman's DNA and published the results in Cell Journal in September 2019, the findings triggered an international controversy. Because this ancient DNA proved that modern South Asians descend directly from a civilization that history barely remembers, not from Persia, not from Central Asian warriors, but from the Indus Valley Civilization, a Bronze Age superpower that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia, but somehow vanished from collective memory. Here's what shocked the scientists. This 4,500-year-old genome contained zero ancestry from the steppe pastoralists who were supposed to have founded Indian civilization. Zero. The genetic signature didn't match the historical narrative taught in schools across the subcontinent, and it gets stranger. Vasant Shinde, the Indian co-author of the study, later faced pressure to retract the findings. Why? Because in 2024, a Science magazine investigation revealed that genetic research in India had become politically explosive. Admitting that ancient DNA contradicted nationalist origin myths threatened government-backed historical narratives, but the evidence was undeniable. Reich's team discovered that the Rakhigarhi woman wasn't an isolated case. They had found 11 other individuals with matching genetic profiles buried across Iran and Turkmenistan, evidence of a vast, ancient network deliberately erased from history. If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries that challenge everything you were taught, subscribe for more untold stories backed by real science. So if these people built one of the world's greatest civilizations, why did they vanish so completely that even their language is lost? The Harappan civilization wasn't small. Between 2,600 and 1,900 BCE, it covered over 1 million square kilometers of South Asia. And that's larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They built cities that wouldn't be matched in sophistication for 2,000 years. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi. Each city featured advanced drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, planned street grids, and multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing. While European tribes were still living in simple agricultural villages, the Harappans were conducting international trade, using standardized weights for commerce, and writing in a script we still can't decipher. That script is one of history's greatest mysteries. Archaeologists have discovered over 4,000 inscriptions on seals, pottery, and tablets. But despite decades of effort, even with artificial intelligence and machine learning, researchers in 2025 still cannot crack the Harappan writing system. In January 2025, the challenge became so frustrating that an Indian leader offered $1 million to anyone who could decipher it. So far, no one has claimed the prize. Here's what researcher Nisha Yadav at the Tata Institute in Mumbai discovered using machine learning. The script is organized, not random. Her team identified 67 core signs that make up 80% of all inscriptions. The writing follows clear patterns. Texts start with more signs and end with fewer specific combinations appear more frequently than random chance would predict. It's definitely a language. We just don't know what it says. But here's the real question. If this civilization was so advanced, so widespread, so sophisticated, why don't we learn about them in school? The answer is political. Later empires, Persian, Greek, Mughal, the British, all had reasons to minimize or ignore pre-Aryan civilizations. Acknowledging the Harappans meant admitting that sophisticated urban culture existed before the Indo-Aryans arrived. It complicated territorial claims, religious narratives, and nationalist histories. So the Harappans were quietly erased. Their cities became footnotes, their achievements were attributed to later cultures, and their DNA sat buried in the ground, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. But here's what shocked geneticists when they finally extracted that DNA. These people didn't come from where anyone expected. When David Reich's Harvard team published their analysis in Cell in 2019, The genetic profile was unlike anything they'd seen before. The Harappans were a unique mixture, roughly 60 to 65% ancient Iranian farmer ancestry, which combined with 20 to 25% Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer DNA. It's a combination that exists nowhere else on Earth. But what really stunned researchers was what was missing. Zero Anatolian farmer ancestry, the genetic component that spread across almost all of Eurasia during the Neolithic period, and zero steppe pastoralist ancestry, the signature that defines modern Europeans and many modern Indians. Vaghish Narasimhan, a Harvard researcher who co-led the study, explained the significance. This meant the Harappans developed agriculture independently. They didn't receive farming techniques through migration from the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture supposedly originated. They figured it out on their own. The genetic profile appears suddenly across multiple archaeological sites around 3,300 BCE. Not gradually, over centuries, but within a narrow time frame. This suggests a coordinated migration event from an unknown ghost population whose homeland we haven't found yet. Extracting this data was extraordinarily difficult. Narasimhan described the challenge. Ancient DNA in hot, humid climates degrades rapidly. The team had to develop new techniques to amplify minuscule genetic signals while filtering out contamination from soil bacteria, modern DNA, and environmental degradation. That's why only one skeleton out of 61 worked, and why this single genome is so precious. But the mystery deepens. If the Harappans weren't related to Middle Eastern farmers, and they weren't descended from steppe warriors, who were they? And why does their genetic signature keep showing up in mysterious, outlier individuals buried thousands of miles away in Central Asia? Those 11 genetic outliers that Reich's team found, scattered across Iran and Turkmenistan, weren't anomalies. They were part of something much bigger, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. Archaeologists call it BMAC, a Bronze Age culture that flourished in Central Asia between 2300 and 1700 BCE. And genetic studies published in Molecular Biology and Evolution in 2021 revealed something extraordinary. BMAC, people shared ancestry components with the Harappans, creating a vast cultural and genetic network spanning from the Indus Valley to the Caspian Sea. The genetic profile of BMAC populations shows a mixture of Iranian farmer, Anatolian farmer, and Siberian hunter-gatherer ancestry. Not identical to Harappans, but overlapping enough to prove extensive contact, and the archaeology confirms it. Harappan goods, carnelian beads, our distinctive pottery styles, copper tools, have been excavated from BMAC sites. BMAC artifacts appear in Harappan cities. These weren't isolated civilizations, they were trading partners. But here's the twist that changes everything. Around 2100 BCE, something new appears in the genetic record. Steppe ancestry suddenly shows up in Central Asian populations. DNA from BMAC outlier individuals starts containing genetic signatures from northern pastoralist groups, but not in Harappan sites. The steppe migration reached Central Asia first. The genetic evidence proves that steppe pastoralists arrived in the Indus Valley after the Harappan collapse, not before. This demolishes the old Aryan invasion theory that claims steppe warriors conquered and destroyed the Harappans. The timeline is wrong. The genetics prove it. By the time steppe groups migrated south into India, around 1500 to 1300 BCE, they found abandoned cities, not a thriving civilization. So, if invaders didn't destroy the Harappans, what did? The answer just emerged in December 2025, and it's more terrifying than war. In December 2025, researchers at IIT Kharagpur published a groundbreaking study in Communications, Earth, and Environment. They had finally solved the mystery of the Harappan collapse. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was drought. But not the kind of drought that lasts a season or even a decade. The study identified what scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period beginning around 2200 BCE when solar variability and shifting El Niño patterns caused South Asian monsoons to weaken dramatically. But here's what makes this different from earlier theories. The drought wasn't sudden and short. It was repeated, long, and intensifying. Generation after generation, the rains became less predictable. Rivers shrank. Crops failed more frequently. Water sources dried up. The civilization didn't collapse overnight. It slowly strangled over centuries. Dr. Gwen Robbins-Shug, a bioarchaeologist who analyzed skeletal remains from Harappa, found something chilling in the bones. In the later periods of the civilization, around 1900 to 1700 BCE, rates of violence skyrocketed. Traumatic injuries, skull fractures, defensive wounds, all increased dramatically. Infectious disease markers also surged. Malnutrition became visible in bone development. The society was falling apart from within. Man, and here's the darkest detail. Individuals buried outside formal cemeteries, likely lower castes or social outcasts, showed the highest rates of trauma and disease. The Harappans, despite earlier theories of an egalitarian society, had clear social hierarchies, and when resources became scarce, those at the bottom suffered first. This wasn't a peaceful, gradual migration to greener pastures. This was societal collapse, driven by environmental catastrophe and escalating internal conflict. As the rivers dried and crops failed, the cities emptied. People didn't just die, they ran, and their DNA tells us exactly where they went. Between 1900 and 1300 BCE, the Harappan genetic signature disperses across South Asia. You can track the migration in modern DNA. Geneticists call it the Indus periphery ancestry component, while some researchers refer to it as AASI, Ancient Ancestral South Indians, and it's the primary genetic foundation of every South Asian population alive today. The refugees moved in different directions. Some traveled southeast into peninsular India, merging with local hunter-gatherer populations. These groups likely spread the Dravidian language family, which a 2021 study in Nature argues was the original Harappan language. Others moved northeast into the Gangetic Plain, where their descendants would later mix with incoming steppe populations to form the genetic basis of Indo-Aryan speaking groups. And here's where the timeline becomes crucial. The steppe pastoralist migration into India happened after the Harappan cities had already been abandoned. The genetic evidence, published in multiple studies between 2019 and 2021, is unambiguous. Steppe ancestry begins appearing in South Asian populations only after 1500 BCE. The newcomers brought Indo-European languages, new cultural practices, and a genetic component that now exists in nearly all modern Indian groups, especially in higher castes and northern populations. But they didn't conquer the Harappans. They moved into a vacuum left by environmental collapse. The mixing happened gradually, over centuries. Steppe males intermarried with local women. Cultural practices blended, languages merged, and over time the memory of the Harappans faded. But the DNA remained, and that DNA is now causing a political firestorm. Because the genetic evidence proves something that many politicians don't want you to know. In November 2024, Science magazine published an investigation titled, "In Politically Sensitive Study, India Looks to DNA to Track Ancient Migrations." The article revealed what scientists had known privately for years. Genetic research in India had become politically dangerous. The problem is simple. Genetic evidence proves that steppe pastoralists migrated into India around 1500 BCE, bringing Indo-European languages and mixing with the existing Harappan-descended populations. But Hindu nationalist groups promote a different theory called out of India. This theory claims that Indo-Aryan culture originated within India and spread outward, making the subcontinent the source of civilization rather than a destination for migrants. Admitting that steppe ancestry played a crucial role means accepting that the Vedic culture, the foundation of modern Hinduism, came from outside India. It undermines territorial claims. Chalcin complicates ethnic identity narratives and contradicts religious origin stories. And so researchers have faced pressure. Vasant Shinde, the Indian archaeologist who co-authored the 2019 cell study with David Reich, later attempted to walk back his findings. In 2025, he suggested that his references to steppe migration timing were a mistake, despite the published genetic data being clear. David Reich's team, working from Harvard, faced no such pressure. Their 2019 study in Science analyzed 524 ancient genomes, the largest dataset ever assembled. The conclusions were unambiguous. Steppe ancestry arrived in India between 1500 and 1000 BCE and now exists in nearly every modern Indian population. But the political backlash has been fierce, or some Indian researchers have been labeled as anti-national. Government officials have questioned funding for projects that might produce inconvenient results. The real question isn't about the science anymore. The evidence is settled. The question is about identity. If your DNA reveals an ancestry your culture erased, who are you really? While politicians argue, geneticists keep working, and they've made another discovery, one that changes everything we know about the Harappan legacy. Despite millennia of migrations, invasions, and mixing, the Harappan genetic component remains the dominant ancestry in South Asia. Especially in southern Indian populations and tribal groups, Harappan-related DNA makes up 60 to 70% of the total genetic profile. The steppe component, by contrast, is much smaller, sometimes less than 20%, but concentrated primarily in northern and upper caste groups. In 2024, recognizing the importance of continued research, the Indian government partnered with the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences to launch a new ancient DNA extraction project. The goal: sample DNA from additional Harappan sites and compare it with modern Indian populations. Neeraj Rai, the lead researcher, stated the mission clearly. Comparing ancient DNA with modern DNA from India is critical for understanding India's complicated migration history. The project completion was expected in December 2025, and early results are already expanding what we know about regional genetic variation. But beyond genetics, there's another layer to the Harappan legacy: some cultural traditions, specific harvest festivals, pottery-making techniques, architectural styles, maybe 5,000-year-old survivals passed through unbroken lineages. Without written records, it's impossible to prove definitively, but the archaeological parallels are striking. Certain ritual practices in rural southern India mirror patterns found in Harappan artifacts. Clay figurines, mother goddess worship, specific geometric designs, all echo across millennia. The Harappans may have lost their cities, their script, their empire, but they didn't disappear. They became the genetic and cultural foundation of 1.5 billion people living today, which brings us back to the original mystery. If we can trace where the Harappans went, can we trace where they came from? The answer might be underwater. Genetic backtracking allows scientists to trace ancestry to its source. By analyzing DNA from populations across regions and time periods, they can model where the original mixture occurred. For the Harappans, the models point to a region somewhere around the Persian Gulf or the Indus Delta, a place where ancient Iranian farmer populations could have mixed with Southeast Asian hunter-gatherers to create the unique Harappan genetic profile. But here's the problem. No archaeological site matches that profile. The origin point doesn't exist, at least not anymore. 7,000 years ago, sea levels were significantly lower than today. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current boundaries. The Persian Gulf was smaller. River deltas were wider, which means the Harappan homeland could be underwater now, submerged by rising seas, or buried under meters of desert sand, deposited over millennia. And without their script deciphered, we can't access their own records of origin. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their creation myths. We don't know which gods they worshipped or what stories they told about where they came from. It's the equivalent of Egyptian hieroglyphs remaining unsolved forever. The script contains roughly 400 distinct signs, but most inscriptions are short, averaging just 5 symbols. There's no bilingual text, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian writing. No clear numerical patterns that would indicate a mathematical system. No obvious pictographic representations. Machine learning has identified patterns, specific sign combinations, placement rules, frequency distributions. Nisha Yadav's TIFR team proved the script is organized and rule-based, not decorative or random. But proving it's a language and reading that language are completely different challenges. In January 2025, out of sheer frustration, an Indian leader offered $1 million to anyone who could crack the code. Researchers from linguistics, computer science, and archaeology have tried. Some claim breakthroughs, but none have produced verifiable translations that the academic community accepts. So we're left with a civilization that built 1,400 cities, traded across 3 continents, and gave ancestry to 1.5 billion modern people. And we don't even know what they called themselves. The Harappans are history's greatest paradox. Genetically, they're everywhere, the foundational ancestry of South Asia. Historically, they're nowhere, barely a chapter in textbooks, overshadowed by Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. When they left behind cities, trade goods, and DNA. But no epic poems, no king lists, no deciphered records of their beliefs, laws, or daily life. Modern technology is changing that. Every new skeleton excavated could rewrite the story. The Rakhigarhi sample, just one individual out of 61 failed attempts, revolutionized our understanding overnight. David Reich's 2019 study analyzed 524 ancient genomes and was celebrated as a breakthrough. But Reich himself estimates that 90% of ancient human migrations are still unknown, hidden in DNA we haven't yet extracted, which means there could be dozens of other lost civilizations waiting to be discovered, populations that rose, fell, mixed, and vanished without leaving written records. Genetic ghosts embedded in modern populations, invisible until someone asks the right questions. The Harappans weren't erased by invaders or earthquakes. They were erased by drought, time, and political convenience. Later, empires needed simpler origin stories, cleaner narratives, histories that justified territorial claims and religious authority. So the Harappans became footnotes, curiosities, a minor Bronze Age culture mentioned briefly before moving on to the important civilizations. But the DNA doesn't lie, and as genetic technology advances, the truth becomes harder to ignore. Millions of people living today carry Harappan ancestry, but identify with cultures and religions that either didn't exist yet or actively displaced them. The genetic heritage and cultural identity don't align, and that misalignment is creating uncomfortable questions about who owns history. If your DNA reveals ancestors your culture forgot, whose story do you tell? The Harappans left behind cities, DNA, and a script we can't read. But the biggest mystery isn't what happened to them. It's how many other civilizations vanished so completely that we don't even know to look for them. And somewhere, buried in our own DNA, those ghosts are waiting to be found.